Hello, welcome back to my bookshelf. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. Today the topic is the 1745 Jacobite Uprising. In 1822, the celebrated author Sir Walter Scott stage-managed a crucial event in Scotland, the arrival of King George IV. It was the first visit of a reigning British monarch since 1651. That was the year Charles Stuart was crowned king under desperate circumstances, on the run from the English Puritan regime which murdered his father, Charles I. Since then, Stuarts had been restored and overthrown twice, first in favor of William of Orange in 1688, and then again in favor of the detached, pliable, and reliably Protestant House of Hanover in 1714. The 18th century had been punctuated by repeated pro-Stuart uprisings, culminating in the decisive rout of Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobite forces at Culloden in 1746. The next 78 years had brought harsh punishments, reordering, and modernization to Scotland. Sir Walter Scott's Pageant was designed to help dispel any lingering bitterness and promote a harmonious Great Britain. George IV and many courtiers wore tartan, garb that had been suppressed after Culloden, along with most features of Highland culture. This David Wilkie portrait conceals the fact that King George wore pink tights under his kilt, considering bare legs a bridge too far. The Victorians then reinvented the tradition. Scott's Pageant wove a tale of reconciliation between nations and factions. In this, it was much like his most famous novel, Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since. The story of the 1745 Jacobite Uprising, Waverley might just as well have been subtitled Don Quixote in Scotland. Much like Cervantes, Scott both mocks and mourns the chivalric world of ancient loyalties sacrificed in the forging of modern Britain. Don Quixote is a master text for 17th century and even more 18th century culture. It is, of course, the story of a beanpole nobleman from La Mancha who overdoses on chivalric romances. And it points to the proper meaning of the word romantic, which is resembling a tale of daring do and knight-errantry. One day, Don Quixote stops reading and starts imitating. He emerges from his library, eager to set the world to rights. I know that by heaven's will I have been born into this our Iron Age, to revive in it age of gold, he declares. The book addict persuades an illiterate neighbor, the rotund Sancho Panza, to join him on his quest by promising the governorship of an imaginary island, and the two sally forth. This study in opposites has become seared into our minds. The novel's comedy springs from a conflict between Don Quixote's magical expectations and the disenchanted landscape he rides through. Episode after episode, the man of La Mancha takes mundane objects, situations, and people for extraordinary ones, rushing in to right non-existent wrongs and getting badly bruised in the process. Famously, he spies giants where his squire Sancho sees only windmills. He mistakes a flock of sheep for vast armies and an earthy peasant girl for a proud princess. Quote, I am he who is to revive the Knights of the Round Table, announces Don Quixote. Time and again, he bumps up stubbornly against a denuded and rather cruel reality. But the novel does not simply banish magic or hunt chivalric romances to extinction. It also catalogues and reinscribes these things at multiple levels. With Don Quixote, Cervantes gives us a peculiarly modern fairy tale cycle. Don Quixote was published in 1605. A century later, the novel was still gaining in popularity. Cervantes' use of metafictional devices to create the illusion of true events in contrast with the marvelous adventures of romance, was adopted by the early English novelists like Defoe and Richardson. His picaresque is echoed in Fielding's Tom Jones. The songwriter Thomas Durfee, who was a close companion of Charles II and James II, worked with Henry Purcell to produce the comical history of Don Quixote. The Female Quixote, a 1752 novel by blue-stocking Charlotte Lennox, as shown at right, features another brain addled by chivalric romances. An aspiring damsel in distress, the fanciful Arabella tends to mistake gardeners for Barbary pirates. Sir Walter Scott's use of Cervantes is more subtle. His novel includes two figures, one fictional, one historical, who could be classed as Quixotic. The first is the hero, Edward Waverley, a young English officer who gets caught up in the 1745 Jacobite Uprising. The second is the leader of that uprising, bonny Prince Charlie himself. Young Edward Waverley embodies the English Jacobite class. His ancient family has a hereditary faith in High Church and the House of Stuart, and their history follows the arc we have traced in this series on Jacobitism. Waverley's Cavalier ancestors fought with Charles I in the Great Civil Wars, suffered under Oliver Cromwell's Puritan protectorate, and labored to bring about the Restoration. They joyfully ushered Charles II home in 1660. Waverley's numbered among the Tory party, which emerged during the Exclusion Crisis to defend the right of James, Duke of York, to succeed his brother as king. Tory Waverley stood for traditional kingship and against the Whig version of parliamentary supremacy and a figurehead monarchy. Waverley's had defended James II in 1688 and championed the right of his exiled son, James Francis Edward Stuart, to succeed Queen Anne in 1714. They had endured the Whig junto's punishments for refusing to take the oaths to the Hanoverian George I. British legitimists, they stood with James Francis when he lamented, quote, "We have beheld a foreign family, aliens to our country, distant in blood, and strangers even to our language, ascend the throne," unquote. Waverley's had taken up arms in 1715 only to face defeat and the subsequent purging of Tories from every position of power in the three kingdoms. When we meet Edward, a generation after the 1715 uprising, most of the Tory nobility are gradually reconciling themselves to the House of Hanover. But there is many a look of mingled regret and hope, unquote, to the court and exile of the old Chevalier, as James Francis Edward is known. The terms Tory and Jacobite still overlap, but are no longer identical. To young Edward Waverley, the deeds of Waverley's past sound like tales of knight-errantry. Like Don Quixote, he is addicted to chivalrous and romantic lore and lives in a world of imagination. He has the run of his uncle's library at the family estate, Waverley Honour. He pores over, for instance, quote, the deeds of Wilibert of Waverley in the Holy Land, his long absence and perilous adventures, and his return on the evening when the betrothed of his heart had wedded, the generosity with which the crusader relinquished his claims and sought peace in a neighboring cloister. Edward's aunt regales him with Civil War stories and personal memories of the 15, as it was known. Quote, from such legends our hero would steal away to indulge in the fancies they excited, unquote. This tendency, together with the fact that his own family history reads like a chivalric narrative, later tempts him into a leading role. But Edward Waverley wavers between loyalties. His uncle carries a torch for the Stuarts. His father, meanwhile, has shamed the family by going over to the ruling elite. Finding a political creed, quote, more in line with reason and his own self-interest, unquote, the father is, quote, an avowed Whig and a friend of the Hanoverian succession, unquote. As a result, Edward wins a commission in the army and is deployed to Scotland in 1745 with a troop of men from his uncle's lands. The reason? Bonnie Prince Charlie has landed in Scotland. The prince's mission is to march on London and win back the throne for his father, James Francis Edward Stuart. The Jacobites are rising once more. The 24-year-old Prince Charles had been raised in the strange mirror world of the Stuart court in exile. It was during the English Civil War that Louis XIV had first given his embattled cousins a home at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. They had been forced to return there at the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688. For political reasons, they had been obliged to move to papal territories, first Avignon and then Rome. Upon the death of James II in 1701, Pope Clement XI had recognized his son as King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. To his Whiggish enemies, the Prince of Wales had been the warming pan changeling. Now he was the old pretender. To the rather fractious and somewhat unreliable set of Jacobites, he was the old chevalier. Some courtiers were driven by their loyalty to traditional monarchy. They might be Catholic or Anglican. Others had fallen afoul of the Hanoverian regime in some way. Most found their way into the compendium of pie-in-the-sky titles known as the Jacobite peerage. Many joined the Jacobite Prince of Wales on his great quest in 1745. Bonnie Prince Charlie had good reasons for staging the uprising from Scotland. Jacobites were thick on the ground there. Remember, the Stuart dynasty was Scottish in origin. They had ruled that country since 1371. In 1603, King James VI of Scotland had succeeded the virginal Queen Elizabeth I, becoming James I of England. The two countries remained distinct and had separate parliaments. The Act of Union created the entity known as Great Britain in 1707. Because Scotland signed up to the Union in the wake of a major financial disaster which led to serious economic difficulties, arguably creating duress, the Union was unpopular. Many Scots were unhappy at being governed from London, but they could at least console themselves with the fact that the royal family were Scottish. A Stuart, Queen Anne, was on the throne. As it turned out, she was to be the last Stuart. When she died 7 years later, the Whigs ensured that her Catholic half-brother, James Francis, was passed over in favor of the Hanoverian candidate. There was widespread anger in Scotland. Many Scots, Catholic or no, believed they had been tricked out of their sovereignty and were now living under a foreign regime. The Scotland Edward Waverley encounters is exotic indeed, and therein lies its charm. In 18th century England, the hyper-rational Enlightenment vision holds sway. Churches look increasingly like classical temples to reason, with barely even a cross in sight. The medieval world had been consigned to the dustbin, the great chain of loyalties corroded. Ancient lore is dismissed as old wives' tales. Scotland is another thing entirely. Going on leave to stay with a Jacobite family friend, Waverley is delighted to find that the spirit of King Arthur's Britain is alive and well north of the border. He becomes infatuated with the mysterious Flora MacIvor, sister of a proud Highland chieftain. Raised at the Stuart court in exile, Flora is even more loyal to the Jacobite cause than are her menfolk. It's not long before Edward Waverley meets Bonnie Prince Charlie and is tempted to exchange the black cockade of the Hanoverians for the white cockade of the Jacobites. Sir Walter Scott captures the inspirational nature of the actual Bonnie Prince Charlie. His recent depiction in the TV series Outlander as a mincing madman is not only ahistorical, it completely fails to explain why so many men were willing to join him on this incredibly risky adventure. The Charles we find in Waverley makes rational sense precisely because he is a fairy tale Prince Charming. He is gracious, handsome, high-spirited, and courageous, the best of the Ancien Regime. Bonnie Prince Charlie, quote, answers Waverley's ideas of a hero of romance. Come into this iron age to renew the age of gold. And in the best cavalier fashion, the prince seems undaunted by the odds. His cause, he admits with a rueful smile, quote, has little to recommend it but its justice, unquote. Prince Charles knows Waverley to be a member of the English Jacobite class, the very people who can make his venture a success. His strategy depends on reactivating the Jacobite establishment in England, the high church Tory families whose political identity was forged in the defense of the traditional right of succession, of primogeniture. If they had risen, this Quixotic scheme might just have worked. Unfortunately for the historical Bonnie Prince Charlie and his followers, that class had become compromised in the passage of time. Now that law and order had obtained under the House of Hanover for 3 decades, it was difficult to justify their overthrow. Without this key English support, the prince's southbound forces come across as an invasion of wild men. Then as now, the conservative conundrum is this. Once Whiggish revolutionary forces take the day, the new order becomes the conservative position. The Tory party prevailed by absorbing Whig doctrines. The last Jacobite uprising set a pattern we are still living with today. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you next time. It was a right who came